Thank you very much for being here, and DLD, thank you for hosting this session on Vietnam. Before we get started, I was just going to do a brief introduction and allow the panelists to do a brief introduction so everyone had a little bit of a level set of where they've come from, etc. My name is Teague. I'm one of the co-founding partners of TTB Partners, which is a financial advisory and investment firm based in Hong Kong. I was with Goldman Sachs for 20 years in London, New York, and Hong Kong, and have been out in the Asian region for about 12 years or so. And I've done a lot of work in Vietnam. And so on that basis, excited to hear a little bit about the market, but let's let the other panelists introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Phuong. I'm representing Kokok today. So Kokok is a company which is doing search engine and browser for Vietnamese people. It's a really cool company, or you can call it startup. We have almost 400 people and serving around 25 million active monthly users. And the most important thing that we are doing is we are trying to bring more knowledge to Vietnamese people, but in the same time, extremely hard because we are competing with Google in the local market.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tang. I'm a partner at Padma Capital. So we've been investing in India for the past 20 years, Southeast Asia for the past 10 years, and Vietnam for the past 8 years or so, and that's the amount of time that I've been living there personally. And we're a Series A, Series B fund. Our typical first check is about $1 to $5 million. Some of the companies that we've invested in Vietnam include Topica, the largest online education company, iCare Benefits, Trust Circle, Giúp Việc, and a number of others. So that's just a little bit about us.
Hi, I'm Esther. I am the founder and CEO of Pops Worldwide. I've been in Vietnam for almost 12 years now. We are a digital entertainment company serving over 140 million subscribers across multiple different platforms. We have 27 million monthly active users just on our kids vertical, 21 million across our music vertical.
Great. Well, just I think we went through some of the background for the Southeast Asian economies earlier, but just to remind people the size and significance of Vietnam. So it's around 95 million people. It's the second largest or the second fastest growing economy in the Asian region with around 6.8% GDP growth. 50% of the population is under 35. It's a highly educated population with around a 95% literacy rate. A very rapidly growing consumer segment, which has grown from 80 billion US dollars in 2010 to around 170 billion in 2018. Yet there is still the emerging middle class, which is around 13% of the population now, growing to around 26% of the population in the next 5 years or so. I think everyone's lauded it as kind of the next cool market to invest in. I, in particular, working with a lot of Chinese clients, there was the typical kind of Hong Kong, Beijing, Jakarta flight that happened, and now that's turning into Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, much more rapidly than we anticipated. So with that, what I'm curious is, how do you see the Vietnamese consumer? How is it different than some of the other Southeast Asian markets? I know we've spoken around the idea of you need to be very local. Do you believe the Vietnamese consumer is different? Do they look like the global millennial? Do they look more very local? What are some trends that you see that are particular in Vietnam? Maybe Esther, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the consumers in Vietnam are extremely hungry for content, for media. It's definitely a mobile-first country. If you're looking at multiple platforms like Facebook or YouTube, Vietnam is their fastest growing market in terms of media consumption, in terms of time spent on the platforms. So it's a very exciting market in terms of consumption. It's with the infrastructure so, I guess, amenable for the digital companies. I mean, you have free Wi-Fi everywhere. What country can you walk in and have free Wi-Fi? So where they're consuming content in coffee shops, if they're standing still on their motorbike, I mean, just everywhere. And so for us, it's great because they're, you know, they're consuming so much of content.
And one of the interesting facts there is that Apple actually has a very high penetration, so it's much more iOS than Android, which is kind of unusual if you think about sort of where the economy is growing. Do you think that's, is there anything in particular in that they are looking more for a status symbol, or is it something where it's just more, you know, what kind of drives the younger consumer in terms of making those decisions?
I think, well, with mobile phones, it's definitely a status symbol. However, you know, if you're looking even beyond the urban cities, like everyone has a smartphone. Smartphones are now, you can get one for $50. So I think that status symbol has already passed. So I don't know, maybe Phuong can answer that one.
Yeah, I think that I am the most Vietnamese person in this panel. So we noticed that people are using more and more digitalizing. As Esther said, that the penetration of mobile is growing very, very fast, and everybody is using a smartphone. But in big cities, we still see that people are spending a lot of time on multiple devices like smart TVs, and still a lot of time on desktop. But we can see that the consumer's behavior is changing pretty fast. And you can imagine that before you have to go out to have lunch, but now when you have Grab, you have Uber, and it completely changes the behavior. It's very cheap to have food in the street, but it's also very cheap to have food delivered to your door. So now it's very hot outside. You don't need to go out. You just sit in the room and you can have the whole world delivered to you with extremely cheap delivery fee. So I think that digital is changing a lot the life of Vietnamese people. And I think that digital in education as well, since you are invested in the biggest startup.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add on to the points that Phuong and Esther have shared, you know, I think our experience has been that it's actually, I mean, while I think there's a lot of hype and exuberance about the Vietnamese consumer and the Vietnamese middle class, it's actually quite challenging to generate, you know, long-term sustainable value from the market. I think, and that's because we see that the consumers is maybe a little like fickle. So I think they, especially for kind of the low-ticket, you know, small purchase kind of items. I mean, there's, you know, it's this kind of herd mentality, right? I think there's a lot of KOL, KOL kind of driving kind of purchasing trends in the market, right? So I think one day it's, you know, this K-beauty kind of product, which is the hottest thing. The next thing it's, you know, this bubble tea brand, right? And I think that that kind of switching just keeps on happening. I think it looks a little bit different outside of that kind of more consumerist consumer base when you turn to things like health or education. And I think that's why we're really interested in those different verticals. So I think if you look at health and education, there is a huge gap between the public service provided by the government, which is, you know, long waiting times, kind of variable quality. I think some of those challenges that we see in other markets. And I think as for the private sector, I mean, it's really playing at a very elite kind of level, right? Looking at the top 10% of the market, very expensive kind of private schools, private hospitals. So I think for us, I mean, we are looking for, you know, a product which is very sticky, right? And where you see really good retention metrics. And I think we've seen that more in kind of products, say, like education or healthcare, which is not kind of that, you know, quick switch, kind of very, you know, fickle and kind of flaky behavior across different brands.
So you mentioned a little bit, and I think we've got representations here from both startups and also investors. As you've seen foreign direct investment come into Vietnam, and particularly capital, from the venture capital and growth capital segments come into Vietnam, how has that changed your marketplace? Do you see it it almost feels like if you compare it versus Indonesia, where you had so much capital going to Indonesia at very early stages, spending, do you think the capital that's going into Vietnam may be a little bit more rational, or do you see it almost as competitive and as much liquidity, which again creates some of the challenges in terms of finding long-term sustainable opportunities?
Yeah, I think it's very natural that investors are now turning to Vietnam, right, as this kind of the next growth opportunity. I think Indonesia is very crowded, and I think in general kind of quite overpriced, especially in verticals like fintech or health tech. So I also think that there's a huge gap between what we see in like TechCrunch or Deal Street Asia as far as reporting on Vietnam is concerned and the reality of raising capital on the ground. I still think there's lots of entrepreneurs, good entrepreneurs who are hungry for funding, but they're not getting kind of 5 term sheets within a couple of weeks, which is the same kind of trend you might see in Indonesia. I think many investors are talking about investing in Vietnam, but still haven't invested in putting a team on the ground, which I think is so critical if you want to be a successful investor in Vietnam. And I think they're also grappling with some of the legal or regulatory issues, like, okay, how do we, it's easy enough to get our money in, how do we get the money out, right? And they're still trying to answer some of these pretty basic questions. So I think only, maybe not more than a handful, but still maybe in the tens only of regional investors have pulled the trigger on Vietnamese deals, and that's only happened in the last year or so.
Well, I've been in Vietnam for 12 years, and I've seen the cycle. Vietnam was hot, and then it wasn't. And it was hot, and it wasn't. But right now, it's definitely hot. And when I used to go and have to fundraise, it was a chore. I had to go and explain even where Vietnam was on the map. However, now it's been very exciting. We just raised $30 million, and the first time I said it out loud in front of a crowd. Thank you. But it was quite a different experience fundraising this time around, where investors were really hungry and very excited, and they were turning around term sheets really quick. So it was definitely a different experience, and I think it's because Vietnam is such a great market at the moment.
It's hard for me to say because we are looking for it. I can only tell you, is it true we are hungry? Is it a lot of capital rational or not after we raise? So we are looking for investment, and we can tell you only after it. I think, I hope that next year when we are here in Singapore, I can tell it we were successful and it was really, really cool. I hope so.
I'm sure it will be. So along those lines, there are a couple of other macro factors which define Vietnam as well. There's still it's still not a 100% urbanized population. There's still quite a lot of people living in more rural areas. There's still a significant amount of underbanked and underserved populations on the financial services side. How do you see, in particular, as a lot of innovation and capital goes to the big urban areas, how do you see opportunities that you can either use that to your advantage, meaning the opportunities on the urban side, on the ruralization side, as those population becomes more urban, et cetera? Do you think that provides an opportunity? Does it provide an impediment? How do you view those sort of dynamics?
I can have a stab, but feel free to jump in. So I think, for us at Panama Capital, our sweet spot really has been investing in, the mass market, right? And I think for us, that definitely means, the population outside of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And I think we've invested a lot of time in trying to understand those markets. And I think, an interesting, anecdote is that, you can drive, 1.5 hours outside of, Hanoi, for example, and you ask around and nobody's ever heard of Momo. And Momo is the largest digital e-wallet kind of provider in Vietnam with, I think, they claim they have 10 million users, right? And, just outside of Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, you can ask around and the concept of, digital payments is a completely different world, right? So I think it presents a really exciting opportunity. I think what it means, or the implication of that is, I think for us, we've always had to look at founders who are very, customer-centric, customer-focused, which might seem quite obvious, but I think in Vietnam, one of the things that we see time and time again is that they're very kind of product-focused founders, right? Building a beautiful, great product, which they themselves and their engineers and their teams can use, but may not be a great fit for that mass market living outside of the major cities, right? So there's very, I think, a limited number of people who've invested time in really understanding, what a mom-and-pop store in in a tier 2 or tier 3 city of Vietnam might need, right? Or a factory worker. I mean, that's a huge market. I think there's millions of factory workers in Vietnam. And we've invested in some companies which are serving their needs. But I think very few people are really focused on those issues.
One other question that sort of has come to mind, and I know it often comes up when people look at a number of the Asian markets, in particular China, and there's always the political system sort of government overlay. In particular, I think it's probably something that is obviously very significant, but less understood in Vietnam. How does the government, either regulatory focus, political system, et cetera, how does that impact both digital growth of the consumer, and also are there any things that people maybe who are not as familiar with the market should be aware of? And also, how do you think it impacts potentially investors looking at the market?
I can say that in terms of we as a company don't have any bad impact from the government regulations. Like Vietnam is trying to prevent somehow Vietnamese local entrepreneurs by bringing cybersecurity laws. They try to make global company to put servers in Vietnam, but it's not very strict. For example, Google and Facebook, they don't put servers in Vietnam, but they still operate. So it's not like, if you are not here, we will ban you. And now, for example, Ministry of Information, they stimulate more, and they have a program called Make in Vietnam to stimulate people in Vietnam to build products for Vietnamese people and use in Vietnam. We used to have a lot of global company who enters the market, but it's more and more difficult to control them, that you cannot tell to Google that you have to do this or that. So that's why they are trying to make a life of local companies easier, especially in IT industry. At least I can see it.
We have quite a close relationship with the government, because we're in the media space. And interesting enough, we're in the middle between the big companies like Google and Facebook, and then also on one hand, the government. And so it's quite interesting to hear from both sides their position. But when speaking to the government, they're extremely supportive of local companies or companies who are trying to live by the rules of the government. So I think they're extremely supportive. They're open for communication. They're looking for guidance as to what's the next step to grow the economy and the startup community. So I think it's been quite good for us, actually.
I'm glad a political system somewhere is working. Being an American, I can say this at the moment. But question is you see Vietnam, I think, has been sort of hinted that with the U.S.-China trade war tensions, that this will be an economy which will benefit. And we've already seen a number of Chinese textile producers, electronics producers, I think Alexandra mentioned it previously in the introduction, who've made the transition. Do you see that kind of on a real-time basis? Do you think it is obviously, I'm assuming it's having a positive impact on the economy, but do you really see this, is it just a few couple of headlines, or do you see it in real life?
I think it's real. It's really real. A lot of the investors who normally would have invested in U.S. or looked at other countries are now aggressively looking at Vietnam as another location for investments, and I think that's a positive sign for Vietnam and the entrepreneurs and companies.
Well, that actually gets me to another question, which is, the government has spent a lot of money on education, and as we said, it's 95% literacy rate, a very, very high level of technical expertise around engineering and mathematics. But interestingly, and I know that when we were speaking before about Singapore as a local sort of education entrepreneur market, there is a significant number of entrepreneurs in Vietnam, a lot of which are women, which I think we can see illustrated here. Is there anything particular in the education system that you think drives entrepreneurship, drives perhaps such a high level or penetration of women into the workforce? Do you think there's anything particular which differentiates Vietnam if you look at some of the other Southeast Asian or Asian economies?
As I'm most Vietnamese again, I don't see any. So now it's a kind of trendy. Everybody is speaking like, okay, if you're a woman, if you're an entrepreneur, you should share this and bring this spirit to the rest of the audience, because we still. There is still a thought, if you meet some government people and you are a woman and you are doing business, there is still, at least I feel, there is still kind of, you're a woman, you're doing business, but it's now less and less. And I think that it's still, but in some way probably it's, you have more benefits, because it's like people still support it. We want to bring knowledge to inspire other women to grow the economy in the country, I guess so.
I don't think it's so much of the education, but the culture of Vietnam. The whole country's run by women. Now, Vietjet, I mean, is founded by a woman. All the media companies in Vietnam are run and founded by women. So I think it's a cultural thing. It's an acceptable. It's just the norm. And so when people talk about women CEOs, I'm like, it's an everyday thing in Vietnam. I don't see it as an exception.
So we've spoken about a lot of the good things about the economy and the market. I always ask, like asking the question, what are you worried about? Either for investment or for your company, either macro or micro. What keeps you awake as you think about that you are investing your capital and your time and your focus on the Vietnamese market? What do you think could go wrong? Maybe Nguyen?
Yeah, I think, a couple of things. I think it relates a bit to your earlier question about the political and kind of regulatory environment in Vietnam, which I agree with the other panelists has been, I think one of the, the great gifts that Vietnam has up till date, right? I think it's one of the most stable countries in the region, very consistent FDI flows, et cetera. I think one of the risks that I think many countries in the region are trying to navigate, right, is the relationship between between China and the US, and I think there is I think there's also interesting kind of historical and political issues in the relationship between Vietnam and China. I think that has flared up at times quite dramatically in the past few years, right? I think with riots, et cetera. And I think those kinds of things can shake the confidence of of investors, of the people pretty significantly. But I think apart from that, I think the macro picture is just so strong, right? And I think there's still so much more potential in the market. So I think I'm overall pretty bullish.
I think for us, it's more of there's so many opportunities in Vietnam and the rest of the region. For us, is how do I find more people who can execute on our vision and on all the opportunities that surround us. And so for us, it's about finding the right people that fit within the culture of the company.
And I actually think that was a point that was brought up earlier this morning around finding the right talent, et cetera. Do you see more people returning, in China they call them the turtles, but I'm not sure if it's the same term in Vietnam, but do you see more people returning from education overseas? Obviously, some of you have, but curious if you find that as a trend, or are people not leaving in the first place and just staying?
Yeah, no, there's over, I think, 30,000 students now studying in the US. So when I first came back, the first 5 years were really difficult. It was really hard to find experienced workforce or anyone with an open mind. They were so very closed. But now I have quite a number of workforce who left, went to school overseas, and have come back. And their mindset set, their drive, the way they lead, the way they think about problems and how to solve problems are much different now. And it's very exciting. And I think another 5 years, it's going to even, when those 30,000 come back to Vietnam, I think it's going to be even more exciting, an exciting workforce.
But I also think that it's related to cultural, because I'm Vietnamese. I lived in Ukraine for 20 years, but from the very beginning, my parents told me that we will come back to Vietnam after you graduate university. So it was mandate for me and for the rest of our family. I know that there are a lot of people who are living abroad by some reason, and when the second generation is growing, they send them back to Vietnam. And it's like, I even don't understand what is the reason behind it, but just like you get something outside and then you bring it back to Vietnam. So it's like, yeah, it's a trend. It's not only about the trend, but it's also about the culture. I know a lot of people who who have a good job, for example, in IT companies in Silicon Valley, and they still come back to Vietnam. It's easy for them, I guess, now to do business, to be an entrepreneur in Vietnam.
So maybe, as Steffi said at the beginning of the session, we're all trying to find out what the next big thing is globally. Maybe for each three of you, what is the next big thing in Vietnam? Is it a company? Is it a trend? Is it if you were going to sort of say how you think that your vision in terms of both your company or investing may be affected over the next 24, 36 months or so, what do you think it's going to be?
I think for us, it's the other half of the population who are not connected and not for us to reach that market. And I think that's definitely achievable over the next few years.
Do you see any particular companies doing that really well so far? I mean, I know in Indonesia, you've seen a number of companies that have gone out and tried to go out into the more rural areas and get their footprint out there. So is it an offline to online play or online to offline play? Are you doing it through content? Is there one particular company that you've seen that's doing it very well, in addition to yours, of course?
No, I haven't seen anyone who's really done it except Viettel, which is the telco who is forming that base. You know, they gained market share number one in the country because they went rural. That's how they became number one. So, but for startups, and I haven't seen any that's actually gone that way. But for us, it's definitely a big force for us to reach all those people who are not connected and to serve them really good content.
Yeah, I think I agree with Esther because we have 96 million population and only half of them are connected to internet. So it's the rest 50. And they're not yet connected to internet, and as the population is very, very young, as you mentioned, that 50% is below 35, and so it's a really, really potential market. And we do see all the potentials, and what we do is we're trying to reach, because if you live in urban area, you have multiple choices. Everybody is considering you as their consumer. But if you are on rural, not yet many people are paying attention to it. So it's a really big piece of pie, and since they don't have a lot of choices and they're not so well educated, they don't speak well English. So if you focus on the local market, you provide some special optimized features for them, I believe that you will have a really, really big growth.
Yeah, I think there's this theme coming out, which seems to be this kind of this massive underserved population in Vietnam. And I think for us to maybe put a bit of a different spin on that, I think we're really interested in kind of the SME market, right? And micro SME market, and all the different ways that, that they can be served. Because if you look at Vietnam, it's a country run by all these very small kind of, mom and pop stores, these brands, which I think is not unique in Southeast Asia, definitely. But I think that strong I think, like 1 in 5 kind of Vietnamese have their own kind of small business of some kind, right? So I think one of the highest rates of small business ownership in the world. And I think there's still many basic problems for them that haven't been solved yet, and that could be around access to credit, right? I mean, I think that's still at a very early stage in Vietnam. SME lending, the banks haven't really been able to get into that segment and serve it and kind of control the risk management at the same time. Peer-to-peer lending, there's still no regime for peer-to-peer lending in Vietnam. It's only being developed right now. So I think that all those players haven't entered the market legally yet. And not just in lending, right? I mean, I think, how do you give them better access to kind of global supply chains? How do you help increase their customer base, generate, help them with their marketing and sales efforts? So I think there's many opportunities there, which we're looking at now.
Great. Well, we have probably time for 1 to 2 questions from the audience. I know no one's asked questions yet so far, but if there is a question that people may have an interest in, if not, we can continue up here. But I thought, yep. Sorry. Please, if you don't mind introducing yourself first, too.
Yes, hi, my name is Max. I'm an entrepreneur. My wife is Vietnamese. I'm also a big believer of the Vietnamese opportunity. But you have not talked about the biggest challenge yet in Vietnam, which is the environmental challenge that especially Hanoi is facing. Hanoi has been the #1 city with the worst air quality in the world. I mean, it was even higher than in Dhaka, Bangladesh. But no one is going on the street, or no one is providing, radical solutions. So what's your take on this?
As a person who was affected by the not only bad air, but also the worst situation with water, recently in Vietnam, I can tell you that, it's extremely bad when you don't have good air to breathe, and you even don't have good water to do the rest. Yeah. So, but there are some research surveys that Vietnam is one of top happiest country in the world, and people. I cannot say that we care too much about it. Of course, it's a big sign everywhere. You should not go outside because it's very bad. But you still see a lot of people in the street in daytime, in nighttime. I would say that people only, maybe only extremely wealthy people, they care about it. They bring their kids and say, you have to do something to improve the environment. But if you still care about the economical situation of the family, and it's the first question, so I don't see many people caring too much about it. It was some, in every newspaper you can see the headline, like bad air, but it was very easy. Some guy rated 1 star for this app. It closes they don't provide this app in Vietnam, so everybody's still happy.
It's interesting, actually. It's a good question that you raise. And if you look at, take China back in 2003, 2004, and obviously the air pollution problem there is significant and has been significant. As people get richer, and there are more richer people speaking about the issue, it becomes more and more prominent, and is really when the government gets behind it. Now, the issue is still there in China, but if you look at the amount of capital that is being spent on sustainable sort of and much more cleaner air environment, et cetera. So it sounds like Vietnam maybe has a little bit of a way to go there.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So I guess I have one last question, or one last thing from the panel. So we've spoken about what is the next big opportunity. What is the next, we've spoken about this sort of urban versus rural, the underserved population, et cetera. If you were today, I was going to give you $10 million to start a business, and it could be on any business that you wanted, but you could have your pick of choice in Vietnam, what would it be? Sorry, that was a surprise question, but I figured there was not one from the audience, so I'd ask anyway.
I think that internet is still a driving industry in Vietnam, so it's very fast growing, and there are still a lot of potential. So if I could have the first choice, I would invest in internet. The second is probably agricultural.
I think for me it would be education and specifically K-12, that segment. So I think Topica, the online education company we've invested in, focuses more on kind of adult learners versus school-going age kids. And I think there's a huge opportunity available in K-12. I mean, if you look at the success of Runguru, Zenius in Indonesia, for example, there's no one doing that in Vietnam at scale.
Two are not connected, but I think there are opportunities in two sectors. One is definitely education for K-12, and the second would be and I'm a content person, so in esports, gaming, I think that's a huge vertical that's really untapped at the moment.
Globally.
Yes, globally.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you guys for being here, and really appreciate your participation in the panel. And everyone come to Vietnam.